And mind you, at that time, I'm pretty sure I was 13. I think he was no older than 24. And so for my parents to trust me with a 24-year-old was probably a little bit unusual. Yes, when I was 13, I was sent to school in Switzerland. And my parents thought it was too much to return to New York City for Christmas because it was, if the planes were on time, it would have taken 25 hours. This is 1951, mind you. And so they arranged for Uncle Jimmy to host me in Rome for Christmas. And it was also arranged that Jimmy's older brother, Charles, would be going there with his family. But I would be arriving before Charles, so therefore I was to stay at Jimmy's house or his apartment in Rome. And the deal was that I was going to take a sleeper train from Switzerland to Rome, and he was to meet me when it arrived at 8 o'clock in the morning. He was not there. So at night, I was tired of waiting for him, and obviously there was a problem in communication. So I took a taxi to his apartment and paid the cab driver in lira and rang the doorbell. And his housekeeper and husband were there, and they housed me for the rest of the day, including lunch, playing the piano, that kind of stuff. And Jimmy finally showed up around 7 o'clock at night. He had been in France, I think it was. So we then spent the next 2 or 3 days together. And I remember his taking me to the opera. And I thought it was somewhat incongruous that here I am in Rome, where Mr. Verdi used to hang out, and Puccini and whatever, and he took me to the Merry Widow, sung in English. So that was that. We had quite a few meals together until his older brother Charles showed up, and then I moved in with Charles to the hotel that they were staying in. So that was the first long-term memory. The only time I ever spent alone with them was that Christmas, and that was only for 2 or 3 days. At one point, when I was around 14 or 15 at the most, my parents decided to have the portrait painted of their 4 sons, all sitting at a table playing cards. And this required hours of posing for the painter, the portrait artist. And when the thing was almost all complete, Jimmy came to look at the almost finished thing. And he decided that my 3 brothers looked okay, but I was too handsome and that I should be uglified. And so the painter made a few changes in the portrait so that I wasn't quite as good looking as I thought I was going to be. And so that was his comment. Obviously, it was an honest one from his standpoint. And so that's probably my best anecdote since then. Later on, in another matter, I went to Deerfield Academy after my Swiss school, and Jimmy was teaching with David Jackson at Amherst, and Amherst is about 10 miles from Deerfield. So I occasionally saw Jimmy when I could escape from the campus and have a meal with him at dinner, but I don't remember much of our conversation. Well, he was obviously very talented. I couldn't understand much of what he was writing, so I didn't read very much of it. To me, it was pointless to try to read his poetry when you couldn't understand what he was doing. I thought his first poems, which I think he published in 1951, were understandable. And much of what he wrote thereafter was beyond my comprehension. I'm not a poetry fanatic. So it's sort of like my father. My father said about Jimmy, because my father was managing Jimmy's finances. My father said, yeah, he's a great poet, but where's the money in poetry? And my father, being a capitalist and a chairman of the board of Safeway stores and things like that, and worked at Merrill Lynch before that, he figured it was pointless to do anything in life if you couldn't make some money at it. And I don't think any poet makes any money. I must have done a pretty good job managing Jimmy's money. which I started to do probably in 1965 or so, when my father asked me to take over some of his duties that he had been doing since Jimmy was born. And I must have done a pretty good job doing so, because I continued to do it right up until his death. And then when the news of his death came to me, it came from his lawyer, Milton Maurer. And Milton called me up on the phone and said that my Uncle Jimmy had died, and that he, Milton, and I were the executors of his will. And so that's a pretty big responsibility. And so he must have thought highly enough of my financial acumen to ask me, or appointed me, without even telling me that I was to be the executor of his will. I was worried more about my mother, how she would take it. She was 12 years older than Jimmy, but I was worried. She was very emotional, and she was very family oriented. And so my first thoughts were that my mother was going to take this pretty hard. And so I tried to call her and be the informant. And she was in Palm Beach at the time, and she was out. So she found out through another method. So yeah, my first thoughts were, okay, he died. Now he's too young to die at age 66 or whatever he was. And so I just sort of wondered, well, you don't keel over and die just like that when you're 66 years old. So my thoughts were, what caused his passing? And many of the obituaries don't say anything like that, but he had AIDS. It's pretty widely recognized. It wasn't something that I would have liked to have done, but I have a brother that is homosexual, and I have learned for a long time that that's the way people are. There's nothing that can be done about it. And later on, when I read Jimmy's book, where he tells of his coming out in 1952, a person to remember or something like that. I can't remember the title, but I read that one quite closely. I read the Seraglio quite closely, because even though it was fiction, there was a lot in there that was camouflaged by names that weren't the names of the people who he was trying to make a play out of. So in the Seraglio, for instance, there was a person in the Seraglio, a kid, who is the son of the founder of the firm. And let's say the firm was XYZ. They called the kid XYZ. Well, that's me, because I'm Merrill Magowan, and I'm named after the firm of Merrill Lynch. And the fact that my mother's maiden name was Merrill, my grandfather's name was Merrill. And then my grandfather just happened to have founded Merrill Lynch and Company. So I could tell some of the people in the book. The book starts off with my mother's painting being slashed. Now, he doesn't call my mother Doris Magowan in the book. There's some other fictionalized name, but my mother's painting did get slashed, and a mystery that has yet to be resolved. So that kind of stuff that he wrote about, I could understand. It was the poetry that I was lost with the poetry. We had a very cordial relationship. I think he respected the fact that I was making him money in the stock market. I had very little to do with his support of his trust for all the struggling young artists that he was hoping to help. All I did was make sure that the money was there so he could dispense those funds. But I think it was a very admirable thing on his part to agree to do this in the first place. What was in Jimmy's will, amongst other things, he specifically said that he was leaving nothing to the Magowan children, as they were well provided for. But he was leaving something to his other 5 nephews and nieces from the children of his older brother, Charles. So that's interesting. And he made that discerning thought that the Magowans were well off and the Merrills were not. But then, after giving away some gifts to people here and there, traveling trunks and paintings and rugs and whatever that, of course, I had to make sure they received all this loot. Uh, Most of his went to charity, and they included Amherst, his alma mater, Yale, who gave him a Doctor of Letters degree, so he thought he was appreciative enough of them. Lawrenceville School, which he also went to, Bard College, and the Union of Concerned Scientists, and they all got cumulatively, they got about $20 million, and it was my job to make sure that the funds went that way. And the 5 beneficiaries, charitable beneficiaries, in turn hired an attorney in New Haven, which meant that Yale had something to do with this. And she was to make sure that the charitable beneficiaries got all that was coming their way. And at first, she and I had a very good relationship. And after Jimmy died, made a lot of money, maybe 50%, for these charities. And he left a trust for David Jackson, and he left a trust for Peter Hooton. And I didn't particularly like Peter Hooton, so I resigned from that trust, but I stayed on for David Jackson. And the problem is, after these charitable beneficiaries were getting all this money, Jimmy had specified in his will that no beneficiary was to get an accounting, and nobody was to even look at the will. And this lady in New Haven got somehow a list of those things, and she demanded an accounting. And the Milton Maurer's office in New York gave her one, and she found out that we had given more than we were supposed to David Jackson. David Jackson was living in Key West, Florida, and he didn't have any other source of income. He was getting old, and when you get old, you need caretakers, you need help, and therefore we did what Jimmy would have asked us to do, would have implored us to do, and that was take care, give David enough money. But the attorney in New Haven said you had no right to do that, and she sued me and the other executor for $305,000. And one of the people who therefore she was suing on behalf of was my alma mater, Yale University. So I eventually got out of that lawsuit for $5,000. I sent the check to New Haven, and I said to the Yale people, and that's the last money I'm ever going to send to New Haven. And that was back in 1999 or so, and I have not given Yale a penny ever since then. So that's the story of the will.